And we bring in from the Paydirt podcast, which is now heard on Thursdays here on the station, Tom Hannifan. Tom, welcome. Great to have you back.
Thank you for having me back on, Steve. It's been a big week for us, and we're excited to be a part of the ESPN Radio State College family. It's good times.
It is. And let's say when you're doing something like this and you get going, as you work with a guy like Matt McGloin, how did you sense and when did you sense the chemistry that the two of you have with each other?
It wasn't immediate. That was the thing. So I've probably told the story, but he and I had exclusively connected via social media before he had reached out to me, and the Believe Network had reached out to Matt about doing a podcast. And so we really didn't know each other all that well. We knew we were fans of each other. I liked what he did in football, and he liked what I did in WWE and professional wrestling. So it was just kind of let's see how this goes. And we got started last August. And you know what it's like. There's not a ton of news necessarily coming out of August camp. You hope not, maybe injuries. So we didn't really start, I think, finding hey, this is my strength, this is his weakness, and yada, 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 until the season really got underway. And that's where I think we really hit our stride, because McGloin's ability to break down a game from the quarterback perspective is fantastic. And then his experience with the Big Ten Network and SiriusXM, he's consuming so much tape on a weekly basis. It's really cool to bounce ideas off him that, frankly, from my point of view, I'm a fan. I'm playing the role of quote unquote, broadcast journalist or something like that. So I'm asking questions and then giving the fan perspective of why in the world did that happen? It's nice to get educated.
Well, that does bring up an interesting point, because I think one of the important elements that you have to have in this job, so if I'm sitting next to Dick Girardi or I'm sitting next to Jack Ham, I always tell everybody, and you know this from the class experience, that one of the more important elements of doing this job or a play-by-play job actually is listening.
100%. It's become so important, because there's little things that, talking to Matt, he'll talk about, for instance, quick game or something like that. And it's hey, break that down for me. Explain that to the audience at home, because he and I understand what that is. But for him to really sit there and analyze why something worked and why it didn't, one of the things I really loved about what he was able to do was Sean Clifford's run there in September and into the Iowa game last season, because he was able to analyze the way that Clifford just destroyed zone coverage that you're just not going to hear from many other people. So I think it's fantastic, but especially when we do interviews, we were fortunate enough to have Trace McSorley on the podcast this past week, aired yesterday on ESPN State College. We've gotten Paul Posluszny, Tom Bahali, the list goes on and on. I just want to hear from these guys. I have my ideas of things I want to talk about, but at the same time, they say something that I'm I wasn't expecting that. We have the ability to go down that rabbit hole in these interviews. So there's just so much that we get to cover.
All right, so this is also the time of the year where it's relatively slow. So what are some of the topics that you want to hit, especially over the next 6 weeks or so before camp actually does get going?
We're very cautious, Steve, about we don't dive into a ton of recruiting news. And it's just waiting to see what happens. And with the way the transfer portal is, a guy could be heralded and, oh, my gosh, yes, he's here. And he could be gone in a couple of months. So we just are hey, we'll see how guys do once they start playing on the field at Beaver Stadium. So we take it kind of on a week-to-week basis. If there's something that's noteworthy to talk about, whether it's for Penn State, the Big Ten, NCAA football as a whole, for instance, the whole Nick Saban, Jimbo Fisher spat a couple of weeks ago, dove into that real briefly, and then we got ourselves into our interview. But I think the fun thing for me, and this is just me as a fan, is that I so appreciate the history of Penn State football, getting to get on there with some of these former players and kind of walk down memory lane, see what they're doing now, see what they think of the current state of college football. And then our hope is in the near future to get members of the existing staff, whether it be the coaching staff or the members of the roster, to see how they're feeling week to week and understanding hey, you and I had talked about this when you jumped on the podcast, but it's hey, there's certain things that they've got to keep close to the vest, but it's hey, take me into the huddle. How is it feeling out there? There's so many different things that we get to do because we focus on the personal, I think, and we focus on headlines when it's appropriate.
Tom, you slipped in there the point about the transfer portal. We know name, image, and likeness and the transfer portal are the two pivotal issues right now. I'm going to ask you the same question I asked Ivan Maisel from On3.com yesterday. My first question to him was, we've gone through 11 months of this now. Is this model sustainable?
No, there does need to be some sort of regulation because the big fear was that college athletics is going to turn into professional sports, and it's beyond that because at least in professional sports you sign a contract and you're probably going to be in the same place for 3, 4, 5 years. We don't even have that right now. So I understand giving players the ability to jump from team to team because coaches do that all the same. So why not let it be equal? But there's got to be better regulation about that.
It's remarkable because, and there's another element, and that's the transfer portal. So, for example, I'm talking to Ed DeChellis last night, the head coach at Navy, and he said, "Yeah, with us the transfer portal is one way." He said, "It's not coming in; they're going out." So, what does this mean for smaller programs, the UNC Wilmingtons of the world, the Loyolas of the world? Can this model be sustainable for them? Or does it send them down a bad path basketball-wise? This isn't football, but the same can be said for MAC programs in football, Mountain West programs in football. I mean, what's it going to do to them?
I think it's going to hurt them, and that's the unfortunate thing about this. And I think Ryan Day was quoted very recently, the head coach at Ohio State, saying that he is going to need $13 million of NIL funds to, quote, keep his roster intact. Think about that. That is an unbelievable number for one of the biggest programs in college football. So the trickle-down effect from that is players are going to start jumping to these bigger schools regardless of whatever reason. They're going to try to get there as best they can. Not that they weren't already trying before, but now the incentive is as big as it possibly could be. So it just becomes even more difficult for, the UNC Wilmington Seahawks to field a basketball team because you're going to have to recruit really well locally and keep your costs down. And then hopefully once NIL opportunities become available, once they're in the door, that you've organized something really, really intelligent that's maybe more locally based. It's local car dealerships, grocery stores, etc. But it's just going to hurt those smaller guys, so to speak.
We just had a season where Cincinnati was able to make the college football playoff. Are we getting to the point, though, if this model continues the way it is, Tom, that suddenly there could be 50 teams in Division I and the other 81 of the 131 are 1AA?
I'm surprised we haven't already gotten to that. I mean, it's amazing that the SEC and the Big Ten have not somehow found a way to jettison themselves from the NCAA to, we heard a rumor a couple years ago of like, maybe the Big Ten, the SEC, and the Pac-12 are just going to go do their own thing. And there's so many different rumors out there from year to year. So I really wouldn't be shocked if that happens, Steve. And frankly, I like the parity of seeing Cincinnati in there. I know television ratings, and you and I have talked about the television ratings for smaller schools don't do great when it's into that final 4 teams of the year. But if they're able to expand the playoff, maybe it's a different argument. And then it's the crazy thing that there's already a much larger playoff model in FCS football, which personally I really enjoy. So I really agree with you on that. I do think we're going to see a gigantic divide at the FBS level at some point that's really drawn in the sand.
And just so the listeners know, FCS has a 24-team playoff. I mean, that's what their playoff is, 24. And by the way, that's NCAA sanctioned. Mm-hmm.
I love that model, Steve. There's been some really great games that have come out of that. I understand There's smaller schools, but now there's such an ability to recruit. And we talk about NIL and transfer portal, but there's no stone unturned throughout the country, throughout Canada now. And, look at what Alabama was able to do in terms of recruiting players from Hawaii years ago to Tagovailoa. If you can get your G4 and fly there, you can go find these kids. Right. So there's talent to be had. It's just a matter of what process do you want them to go through in the postseason.
Exactly, and that's what that's going to be the process they want. All these guys coming by. we're adjacent to the 14th tee, so we've got a lot of company coming by left and right here.
Oh,
now.
fantastic.
It's, they all want me to describe their shots. I'm like, I'm on downtime.
You got to pay for that.
All right, guess what? There has to be a paper exchange for that to happen.
What I've started instituting at Impact Wrestling is a tip jar right at my desk. And it's like, if you'd like me to say something extremely nice about you, you have to put in a certain amount of money. And I use it as a deterrent more than anything.
Well, we don't have to do that with you. We'll praise you anytime. It's great to have you guys a part of what's going on. It's just tremendous, and you and Matt make a great team.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it, Steve. Many more episodes of Paydirt to come Thursdays, 3 p.m. to 4 p.m. Eastern on ESPN.